Hello and welcome to the Clear Voice Podcast. I'm your host, James Groom, and this week we're going to talk about the problem with City Hall and why great leaders quit. With me is President of Clear Career Professionals, Michael Bays. How's it going, Michael?
Doing good, James. Excited to be here today to talk about this important topic and really excited that the Clear Voice is having such a presence.
Yeah, me too. This is one of those things that can make and break any organization, and particularly in government. Tell us a little bit about the issue and why we're even talking about it. Why is it important?
Yeah, absolutely. Since we have the ability to recruit for many municipal entities throughout the country, we get to see a lot of transition in leadership in different roles, whether that's the chief executive, city manager, city administrator role, or even in just department director roles such as public works director or city engineer or those things. And when we really look back at it and all of the work that's being done on leadership, and when you kind of look at the material that's out there and you're looking at the books from Simon Sinek to Stephen Covey to John Maxwell, there's such a leadership hunger and knowledge out there. But in spite of all those things, we have a huge leadership deficit. And then when you look across the country at some of the environments that we work in politically, whether they're politically motivated, maybe national politics, reaching down into lower levels of municipal government and kind of affecting the things that are going on in communities throughout the country. There's a number of roles that are opening up that traditionally wouldn't be opening up because of those circumstances and things going on. And so I think just this topic and having the ability to talk with you about it is really great. And maybe we can present some information and ideas that's helpful to other leaders out there.
Yeah, I know in Texas, the last time I was given the statistic, a police chief's tenure on average is less than 2 years. I don't know what city manager in Texas is or across the nation, but I imagine it's somewhere around there, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years, which, if you can imagine, those important positions being changed out every couple of years in some places makes it very difficult for the people doing there to accomplish. They may be able to do the job that they're doing, but to get to the next level, to create new programs, to run efficiently, because the next person coming in didn't like that idea.
Yeah, absolutely. As we kind of transition into younger and younger generations moving into these leadership roles, it's really important for those who've been in government a long time and then kind of those serving in the mid-level roles to make sure that we're continually impacting the newer generation as they're coming into local government. And when I have the opportunity to talk about a strategic plan as far as how are we going to get people into an organization or how are we going to be able to retain those employees, it's really important that you start looking at the organizational culture and some of the other things we're going to be talking about today in order to really have the highest level impact possible.
What are some of those reasons? Obviously, money is sometimes the cause, although I do have to remind people that if you got into municipal government because of the money, then probably don't need to be here. That's not the main point. And I've found that, at least in my personal experience, that most people aren't leaving for money. So what are they leaving for?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some important statistics that I could share with you. And when you look at SHRM, which is one of the most widely known organizations dealing with human resource management in the country, they'll report that over 32% of employees quit and they cited a toxic or negative work environment. And a lot of times, that's not just something that we don't really know too much about. A lot of times it's the leadership of that culture or the things that are either permitted or encouraged amongst the team members that really is creating that toxicity. And, when you're looking at over, 30% of the employees leaving because of that one reason, that can tend to be really expensive for cities in the amount of human capital that they're losing. The other thing cited is poor leadership. And again, over 30% of the people left because of poor leadership, and over 27% were dissatisfied with their manager or supervisor. That's one of the key things is we have a million books on leadership, but why are we still experiencing such a disconnect between our leaders and our people? And then lastly, Gallup reports that over 42% of employee turnover is preventable. There's a great book out there called Crucial Conversations. It talks about the importance of being able to have those conversations in an organization. What it talks about is the importance of lag time. When, an employee is experiencing something or a leader is experiencing something, or when you see a problem, what's the lag time that it takes for that to be able to reach the people who can actually have an impact on that problem. And in the book, Crucial Conversations, it talks about lag time can be a reflective mirror of the amount of trust within an organization. If employees feel like they can bring things forward, but they're not going to be listened to, or there's going to be no response, then eventually, they just stop reporting those things. I think those are all things that are happening in our work environment that we really need to pay attention to.
Yeah, you mentioned one of my favorite words is trust, because I hear communication a lot. But as you said, it doesn't matter if you're communicating. If no one's going to take care of your problem, then you're going to stop communicating it. And if you don't trust that you're able to say whatever you think you need to say, then that breaks that communication down. So while communication, I think, is key, trust is what drives the ability for communication to even be had.
Yeah, and I think you bring up an important topic. It's something that's really been frustrating me about the last year as I've become more and more aware of what's happening is oftentimes I'll meet with organizations and or leaders and talk about how they're recognizing problems within their work group. And one thing that I think kind of brought this really home for me was I was presenting at the Texas Human Resource Conference this year. I posed a question to all the attendees. The question was, would you feel comfortable walking into the chief executive's office or the city manager's office and letting them know that there is a cultural problem, up to and including that the leader that you're talking to may be part of that problem? I knew that the numbers would be somewhat low on people that felt comfortable with that, but I was kind of astonished that only 2 people felt like they would actually be able to go and have that conversation, or felt like it would be safe for them to go and have that conversation. That created a part of me that really just wanted to delve into that more. I've been talking more and more to leaders and kind of trying to understand that. I actually put in to speak at the Texas City Managers Conference next year because I want to kind of gauge how we can be impactful as leaders on fixing that situation. But needless to say, what a lot of people always respond to me is, well, I have an open door. I think that's the check mark that we as leaders have in verbal repertoire is, hey, well, I've got an open door, and if there's a problem, they can come tell me. I think that's such a fallacy in the sense that it's not necessarily that you don't have an open door. Sure, somebody can walk into your office at any time. It's what happens when they walk in the office. What's your ability to listen? What's your ability to take criticism of the organization that you've been leading, up to and including yourself? And then, more importantly, what's your ability to take action on what's being reported? That's the thing that I think as leaders, we really need to assess ourselves. One thing I talk about in the book I'm writing is you have to not just assume that people are going to come tell you the negatives. You actually have to proactively empower. I know that in organizations I've worked in the past, I've always tried to empower several people or even the entire organization to come forward and go, hey, you have to be able to tell me when problems are happening, and you have to be able to tell me when I'm the problem. When those people come forward and do that, I think that trust kicks in that you're talking about, James, is somebody comes into my office and says, hey, either this decision you made or this thing that you're allowing to have happen is causing a problem and we need to fix it. You have to be able to respond and have the humility enough to make the changes to incorporate into your organization.
For the record, I'm sitting here not talking about this issue because I'm an expert. I know there are people in my organization that may not tell me something because they're afraid of how I'd react. And there are some people that will tell me, but it takes them to get up a little courage and they have to ask several other people that they know to have that conversation with me. So I struggle with this as well. I found out later that somebody knew about something that they probably should have told us, and luckily it didn't result in a critical failure. But when I found out, I made sure to talk to that employee and let them know that I know it's about trust. And I know ultimately that's the leader's responsibility. It's not the follower's responsibility to create the trust between the leader and the follower. It's all on the leader to create that environment and prove that they are trustworthy. And even when you take on a new role, you might get a benefit of the doubt for a little while with some people, but you have to take advantage of that and build upon that, or that just goes away. If you don't prove that you're trustworthy, then it goes away.
Yeah. I think the other side that I really want to make sure we catch on, though, is I see people who will come to me and they've been doing a really good job on the open door policy and the trusting thing. And usually you can tell kind of a little bit about their leadership by the language they use. Sometimes I'll be talking to a leader and they'll start talking about my people or my troops or, my team. And they continually refer to that organization or work group unit or people, maybe below them in the organizational culture or structure as theirs. And, when I start seeing that happen too frequently, what I start seeing is a leader who builds a lot of personal relationships with his team, and almost makes the leader be the focal point of the organization. And the danger in that is when that leader leaves or retires or moves on, it really cripples the organization. And so I think as leaders, we really have to be careful. We want to build those relationships and we want to lead in a very authentic and personal way. But when it starts becoming the fact that people think that you are the reason that the organization is successful, that you really have to change the speech on that. What I've always enjoyed seeing is when I leave an organization, the organization almost not missing a beat. I know to some leaders that might be an ego thing, like, oh man, they didn't even miss me. But really, that's the way it should be. It should be where you've prepared through succession planning and the way that you've worked with your team and the things that you do, that when you leave the organization, for whatever reason, the organization continues and maybe even does better than when you were leading it. And I think that's the true mark of leadership.
Yeah, I think it was, you're going to quote books and I'm going to quote movies, but it was We Were Soldiers, where they were told you need to know your job, the man above you, and the man below your job. And it is very critical. If you're holding as the leader all the information about certain topics, what happens if you get hit by a bus? You may not have any plans on leaving, but unfortunately things do happen, and somebody needs to be able to step in. There should be people that know what's going on, and you should be training them on some of the processes that you do and preparing them for your eventual retirement or whatever it is. And some of those skill sets they need, just to get to the next level. And we need to delegate that authority, and we need to teach people under us how to do our job. And if one day we decide to go somewhere else, then there's capable people inside of our organizations that can just pick up the mantle and run with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is something that we've tried to really impart to a lot of leaders that we've worked with, or even in the recruiting and consulting side of things, is how can we really empower leaders to take on that mantle of continuous self-improvement, but also the improvement of their team. The other thing that we work with, and I know I'll pay homage to Kent Myers here because I know his PhD is involving a lot of succession planning, but succession planning isn't identifying people who are going to do certain jobs within your organization. It's creating the opportunity for everybody to learn how to do those jobs in the organization. There are certain people who will take advantage of those trainings or skill sets or additional job responsibilities, and they will set themselves apart on their own journey. But succession planning is a program, not an identification of people. And I think that's one thing that you can do in a culture, is making sure that almost everybody is empowered to continually grow and move through the organization without favoritism. And then you're, as a leader, creating that opportunity.
Of course, sometimes you're going to have to go outside to find a certain skill set that you don't possess. Somebody's not ready to move on, or maybe you're creating something new and you don't have anybody on the team. Ideally, it's training people to take those promotions and preparing them, because you already know who those people are, and they should be fitting in your culture, which is hopefully healthy. And if they're fitting into a healthy culture that you've helped create, then you kind of already know the kind of person they are, and you're not taking a chance on somebody coming in from the outside who maybe they interview really well, but when they actually get there, they're a totally different person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of culture, they did talk about toxic environments. What is culture? How does that apply to what we're talking about?
I think culture is the key to pretty much any productivity in a work team. And a lot of times people will point to policy or procedures or things like that. But you and I both know that culture reigns supreme in whatever an organization is doing. And I think a lot of times the culture is reflective of the poor management practices that leaders have. And I separate leadership and management skill sets a little bit. I know that the world is very, very high on leadership right now, but there's also a management aspect that's really, really important. Eventually, there has to be somebody that's tightening the nuts and making sure the hatches are locked and making sure that the job is getting done. And sometimes the management structures in which we set up in organizations run counterintuitive to, just doing things and keeping things simple and getting things done. I think, one thing that really needs to be a mantra out there is, how do we eliminate the micromanager? When you start seeing those micromanager skill sets, starting to rear their ugly head, we're realizing maybe the systemic issues within a person that is causing them to be a micromanager. And frequently that can be a number of different factors, but often it's an insecurity about their own leadership or their own knowledge, and they're maybe somewhat afraid that somebody's going to catch that, or maybe they're suffering from some imposter syndrome and don't want that to get out. How do we eliminate the micromanager and really empower the organizational culture? And then I think Simon Sinek talks about it really well. How do leaders get up there and allow people to fail, and understanding that failure is going to be one of the ways in which they really learn how to do the job and really grow, realizing that the manager or leader is going to be blamed for whatever failure is happening in the organization, and being able to explain that. And sometimes in public service, that's hard because we're pretty mission critical. When you respond to a 911 call, whether it's fire, EMS, or police, there's very little room for error there. That's why training is such an important component of some of the specific positions we have in municipal government, and allowing opportunity for failure in those training scenarios and different areas to help the employees grow. And we're always hoping for limited mistakes when we're actually out on calls and dealing with the public. But even when those things happen, responding in a very human way, and hopefully, if it's not a fatal error, encouraging the employee to grow, and then explaining to our communities that we are human and taking responsibility for that.
It's the same thing when you're building internal organizational trust. You should be building that external trust with the community. You are going to make mistakes, and you need to be able to go out to people and explain that, well, yes, they made a mistake and this is the outcome. And hopefully the person you're explaining to outside of the organization trust in you, trust in your position, and can understand that they're going to take care of it. They're going to make sure it doesn't happen again, and whatever punishment was doled out. Jordan Peterson says, he's talking about kids, but I think it applies to just people in general, organizations, that you have to let kids do dangerous things safely. You have to allow them to make those mistakes, because like you said, that's how people learn. You can train them and teach them, but at some point in time, you have to let them fly. And you still monitor them, you still watch them, but if they're not making some of these errors, they're going to make them one way or the other. You want them to fail softly and on small things and build from there.
Yeah, absolutely. That is one way that we can empower our folks to actually have an improved workplace culture, not only when they're sitting at their desk, but also when they go home. I know you have an episode coming up here soon with Danny Kistner and Jeff Spivey, and talking about mental health and wellness and kind of the public safety areas. And unfortunately, we're losing way too many people, some to unfortunately suicide, but also just losing them out of the profession because the profession wears them down so much on a mental scale. When we really look at it and realize how important leadership is to the mental and physical wellness of our employees within the organizations, and how our own toxicity or lack of emotional intelligence or emotional resiliency internally impacts our team. I think, there's some great work going on out there, like with Chad Wright and Forward Partners, and doing some stuff on really recognizing, how do we really look at our internal selves.
I took a training class not too long ago, and there were 50 law enforcement executives in there, and the question was posed about how many people don't like your organizational culture. And several people raised their hand, and the response from the instructor was, well, look in the mirror, because that's where it comes from. It comes from the leader. That culture aspect is very difficult to get right. And sometimes, especially if you're taking on a new role, you may walk into an organization that has that toxic culture, and you have to figure out how to fix it, and quickly, because if you just watch it, you're condoning it.
Yeah. And I think on another note, actually quite a bit of the work we do is with city councils and or boards. One of the first things we do as a recruiting organization is we'll meet with every member of that board and have a really honest discussion about what's going on within their organization, kind of what they're looking for in a leader. I always take the opportunity to talk about how important it is for them to demonstrate leadership from the top of the organization. Lots of our boards and councils are direct representatives of our citizens, and how they represent those citizens empowers that organization that they're volunteering for and giving their time to then bring in the people to actually do the work and serve the community. If you have a toxic leadership board or a toxic council, that is really, really difficult to attract leaders who are then going to be able to bring a positive organizational culture and actually be able to achieve the strategic vision for the organization. I always tell the council members their own behavior is the most important thing thing when we're doing a recruitment, because if a candidate can come in and feel like they have an opportunity to make a difference and an impact, and that the board is going to behave professionally and work through their issues, not that there's ever going to be a board that always agrees, but the way in which they work through their disagreement is extremely important.
I see really great people trying to do a really good job on those councils and boards, and they just don't know how to handle that. They know what the problem is, but they don't know how to handle it. Clear does provide council retreats. That might be a way to provide some training and explain those expectations for boards. So I guess that would be one thing that cities could look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for the most part, most of the elected officials we have on our local community councils and boards are people who deeply care about their community. When they see, things going on that they disagree with, they're very impassioned by that disagreement. They oftentimes let their emotions kind of to run with that. Looking at emotional regulation, how do we regulate ourselves in the way that which we communicate effectively, and then we can move other people? And when you really look at government, is helping solve problems, sometimes at a very high level. And then oftentimes when we're talking about people who are actually providing the service, it's at a very direct level. We need people who can get in and solve problems. And far too often when I'm working with government organizations, the conversation talks far too often about process. And the last thing that an employee should ever say is when they're handling a situation where someone in the community is suffering from a circumstance, the last thing that you want your employee to talk about is the process or the organization process. The process at that point doesn't mean anything to the end user. You can talk about the things that you can do to help solve their problems, and that all be within your process, but you shouldn't make process in and of itself the communicating factor that you're trying to have come across. Really teaching our employees to do that, but also kind of moving that through the entire organization, all the way up to and through the councils, to where we have these certain goals that we want to achieve, but how we do that matters.
For instance, code enforcement, we get a lot of complaints about that, and people are upset because we're telling them to mow their grass. And the answer isn't because it's in the code book or because it's ugly. It's the health and safety aspect of it, explaining to them about mosquitoes and vermin and things like that that are attracted to high weeds. It's amazing when you talk about the why, and that people sometimes better understand it. But it's also, if your process isn't good, and as a frontline employee, it goes back to trust. You have to be able to trust it, be able to tell your boss that this process might work 80% of the time, but then there's 20% of the time where these customers come in and have these issues this process is not working for. It goes back to the trust issue of being able to fix the problems. Identifying the problems and then fixing them are two different things. So that's very important as well. When we've got turnover, so some agencies, some organizations, I think almost operate like it's just part of the business, and certainly some turnover is. But if you have higher turnover, and if you're hitting that 46% or whatever that number from Gallup was of employees that you shouldn't be losing, what are the costs for an organization?
Since we run a recruitment firm, we need to talk about that. And anytime you have turnover and you're getting some professional consulting that you're bringing in, there's recruitment expenses related to that. Beyond that, there's a lot of direct costs that could be training, whatever payout or severance packages you're giving the folks who are leaving. But most importantly, anytime that there is an unexpected change that's not well planned, or even an expected change that maybe we haven't had that good succession planning model in place, there is a huge lag time of being able to achieve the organizational goals and visions when that rapid turnover occurs. There's kind of moving to the indirect costs, and I don't know if you're going to ask me about that or not, but there's a lot of institutional knowledge that leaves an organization, and maybe that knowledge hasn't been passed down to the next generation of workers coming through. And so regardless of who you bring into an organization and their skill set or qualities, there was information that was lost.
We've all seen the news stories. A lot of them are entire police departments resign at the same time. They're usually smaller departments, or entire leadership teams are removed, or places that have had like the entire city executive team turnover several times over years. You would almost be surprised about some of the even small things that are very important that just nobody knew. Some of these things that were being done and how many problems it causes for the people coming in. It's just like a snowball. If you just let that snowball keep coming down the hill, it's going to be too big to stand in front of and stop. You definitely don't want to get yourself into a spiral where you continuously have this turnover and that institutional knowledge loss, that it creates a major problem even out of something small.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's something to be said about momentum. And when you listen to John Maxwell and read some of his work, he definitely talks about the momentum of the organization. And I'm going to borrow from him, but he talks about a train at rest. You can put a 1-inch block in front of the train and that train's not going to get moving. But if you get a little bit of momentum with that train and it's moving down the tracks, you can put a huge wall in front of that train and it's going to bust through the wall. And when you have high turnover, it definitely impacts the momentum of the organization. And even the smallest task feels like it's so hard to achieve because there's no momentum that'll push you through the challenging times or when a difficult decision has to be made.
Organizations cannot sit at rest. They're either moving forward or they're moving backwards. The only constant is change, and you're changing for the worse if you don't have that momentum, if you're not moving forward, if you're not making those positive impacts in the community. What are some of the things that an organization could do to prevent some of this unexpected, unneeded, unnecessary turnover?
I think it all goes back down to the people. And James, I think when we boil it down to that basic concept, what are we doing within the organization that's impacting the people? And something that I really love to talk about is I believe God created in everybody the desire to know and be known. I speak about this a little bit in my book, but I think everybody within an organization wants to feel like they know other people in their organization, mostly in a professional way, but also that the people care about them. And then also, I think people have an innate need to be known, to once in a while you drop in and you say, hey, you're doing a great job. One of the most impactful things that ever happened in my career, James, was early on in my career. I had a captain in a police organization. I came into work and there was a card in my box, and he had just written a little card that just said, Mike, I realize you're doing great work and I appreciate you. It wasn't a lot of fanfare. Nobody knew about it. He didn't come up and present anything or tell anyone about it. But I still have that card today because I felt at that point that I was really known. I think just those simple things, it probably didn't cost him very much time, but it really did make a difference in my life. And I think as a leader, when we start looking at the people and the ability to do some of those things, we can have a huge impact. But even on a larger scale, we need to hold our leaders accountable for, the type of leadership that they're having represent our organizations. If you're a first line supervisor, making sure that your people are known and doing well, and you're building that authentic work group. But then if you're a mid-level manager and or executive or a chief executive, making sure that leadership accountability is true and accurate, and making sure that it's always people focused, understanding that the people are the most valuable asset of any organization. When we start doing those things and not viewing the things that we're doing as checklist oriented, but more of an actual practice that we're doing daily to make sure that our organizations are thriving and make sure the people within our organizations aren't forgotten. And I think that takes care of a lot of the things that are going on. I think even the same thing goes with councils. If you're a city manager out there, I can't believe I'll go into these meetings with councils, and there are managers out there that aren't meeting with their council members at all. The only time they get a chance to meet with the city manager is during a public meeting. I always am sort of astonished with that. I know in my time in service, I always like to meet individually with the council members to make sure they were well informed and in the know, basically, and on the same page as we move forward. That created the ability to have a lot of information for them to consider and hopefully make a decision that's good for the community. It all goes down to what are we doing with the people within our organizations, and then realizing that at the end use of everything that we're doing in municipal government, there are also people that are having their lives impacted by what's going on.
I don't know if you keep up with internet memes, but one of my favorite is the pizza party meme, like we can't give you a raise, or there's these bad problems going on, but don't worry, we bought you pizza, and go enjoy it. And not to say that you can't buy pizza and make it a rewarding experience, but I think employees are definitely catching on to these things that you're just checking the boxes to try to placate the problem. What they want is that direct interaction from their supervisors and sometimes even their supervisors. And depending on the size of your team, you may not be able to meet with everybody individually, but your team may be small enough that you can, or maybe small enough that you can at least meet all the frontline supervisors and have that occasional one-on-one or just brief interaction, or writing that personalized card that they, when they've done something amazing.
In one of the classes that I teach, I have a little PowerPoint from General Colin Powell. It's one of my favorite little videos on YouTube. It's Colin Powell on trust, and I show that in the training class. One of the people in the class raised his hand after that portion, and he said that he served on a military base where Colin Powell was at one point in his career. He said one early morning he was working the guard shack at a gate. Nobody else was around, and Colin Powell just drove up and brought a cup of coffee for him. They just sat in the guard shack and had coffee together and talked almost about anything except for work, how he was doing, what his interests were, and just really on that level of getting to know someone. He said that one interaction was probably one of the highlights of his entire career. When those little things happen like that, you inspire people for a lifetime. And I don't think there is a wage that can compensate for that feeling, or maybe the public accolades that we give to people, while well-deserved, won't reach that feeling. It's those interactions that are sometimes unexpected, and when leaders are most vulnerable and human that have the greatest retention.
It was just a genuine interaction at the moment. And not only did it impact that guy's career, but I'm sure he's told this story to everybody that he knows on base. And even though General Powell probably wasn't doing it for that reason, just by the kindness that he shared that day, it spread amongst other troops.
When we aspire as leaders to, continually work on ourselves and continually recognize our weaknesses, and as a leader, I can tell you I've fallen down so many times, and whatever leadership lessons I have are probably mostly because I've made mistakes and realized what not to do. As we continually grow as leaders and as people, I think that we can achieve success that is beyond measure for our teams and our organizations. So as long as we maintain that humility and make sure that we're doing things for the right reasons.
If there's anybody listening to this and they don't think they make mistakes, I can tell you you're wrong. We all do. One of the keys for me was, a while back, learning and realizing that nobody's perfect, and I'm going to make mistakes, and other people are going to make mistakes, and we're going to have to work through them. If you don't have that mindset, I don't know that you're going to be able to reach higher levels. Being fallible is just being part of human. So some of the retention strategies, we can talk about exit interviews, which are important, but it goes back down to trust. And some people don't want to burn their bridges. I've seen stay interviews. I've employed that before on just having one-on-ones with everybody to kind of suss out what I saw as a organizational-wide problem. It was very eye-opening on what people agreed on as far as what the issue with the organization at that time. If you have any thoughts on having those official one-on-ones with people.
Yeah, I think a lot of those things where stay interviews, onboarding programs, and the number of programs out there are extremely important as long as you don't make them programs. You can have them, but they can't feel like you're just doing it to placate time or say that you've done it, which so frequently happens in organizations. You can turn a real positive by doing the stay interviews into a huge negative if people just feel like it's part of the process. It goes back down to what I call burn barrel authenticity, and you're going to have to read the book to understand what that means. If you've got burn barrel authenticity rolling through your organization, then the tools and mechanisms by which you achieve information and relationships can vary widely and different for many organizations depending on their levels of interaction and service with their team. I think it's all about how we make that very human connection, and then how we continue to support that.
What can Clear do to help out? How do you mitigate some of these things when we're doing executive recruiting? What are you looking for? And what is our role in this for our clients?
It's understanding what's going on within the organization. I think that's where our organizational reviews will really come into play. Part of our organizational review is we'll meet with everybody in the department or work group that we're evaluating, and really giving everybody within that group a voice and kind of understanding that. And as a consultant, again, coming through with authenticity and our intentions of elevating the team. Once we kind of evaluate what's going on, making those recommendations within the organizational culture, and sometimes it is a policy issue, sometimes it is a management issue, sometimes it's a leadership issue, but really identifying those things and then giving a roadmap on how to accelerate improvement and then be able to achieve the organizational objectives. But even beyond that, we offer training in different areas from leadership all the way down to succession planning. We talk a lot about one of our vice presidents, Kent Myers, and his legendary service in government, but his ability to get in and maybe do a training on succession planning can be really impactful. And really, we offer whatever training organizations need to to kind of overcome some of these things. Most importantly is when you're doing a recruitment, just not, viewing it as, hey, we're just filling a position, but really understanding the importance of matching experience, skill sets, and the ability to get in and really be a part of the team when you're doing any type of recruitment, even if it's not a supervisory level. Success is almost 100% about who you bring and keep in your organization. Making sure that you get any opening filled with the right individual is really important.
There's pieces of paper, certifications, college that you have to have just to be competitive in that field. Generally, there's going to be several of those applicants that have all the same pieces of paper. That would be the hard part, is finding that cultural fit, finding the best person to work at X City based on selection process. And I would say that's one of the things that we're looking at, is not just who has the best pieces of paper, but who embodies what that organization is looking for and needs and is going to fill that role the best. And we've provided some information about why people are leaving jobs, but what did we miss, Michael?
I think we've covered pretty much everything, James. I think it's been a really great conversation. And if we can kind of just talk about problems as an opportunity within your organization and not losing hope and kind of throwing up your hands, identifying the cultural issues within your organization. I think all leaders know or kind of have a sense about the problems within their team. And, I think far too often as leaders, maybe we have some cognitive dissonance there and just maybe say, no, I'm not going to ignore that. It's going to get better. But really having the trust within yourself and within the organization to have crucial conversations, as we talked about, maybe bringing in a firm like Clear to do an org review or really assess the problem, and then making sure your team has the abilities and skill sets needed to overcome the challenges that are presented to them, and really just consistently looking at the impact that you're having on people's lives. The most rewarding thing about being involved in municipal government, it isn't the pay or the accolades. It's being able to go out and solve the problems that impact people's lives. And, whether you're the chief executive or you're the employee that's actually going out there and doing the work, there is a huge impact that we have on people. And that's why we love to serve.
Ultimately, it is about the people out there living in our communities, or even having businesses in our communities, or just driving through. They have needs, and we're required to provide certain services to them. And we should remind our employees that service is honorable and very needed.
With our younger folks out there who are getting into municipal government, I think they have that vision. I think they understand the impact that they could potentially have. Sometimes police agencies will ask me about hiring bonus, and I always tell them no. I think we're trying to attract the people who the hiring bonus is in the ability to serve others. I think we need to keep that focus maintained. I have a lot of people always ask me about when they should apply for a job or try to promote. And I always tell them, when you feel like whatever role you're currently serving in, that you could serve more and you're not able to do that because structurally you can't give anymore, that's the time to look to promote. I want to encourage people to consistently look about how much they want to serve. And then any type of leadership step you take is an additional service layer. You don't remove your ability to serve at the line level. I've had some people ask me when they should retire. It's when you feel like you can't give any more service and when you feel like you don't need to grow anymore. And when you run into a combination of those two things, and then maybe retirement is what you should be looking at.
That's great advice. Any final words, Michael?
No, it's been a great conversation. As always, I hope our listeners will continue to look out for the Clear Voice and all of the amazing guests that you're going to be having come through the program, and just continually try to elevate.
Thank you for listening to the Clear Voice podcast, brought to you by Clear Career Professionals. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and we would ask that you share and review the show. You can find more information about Clear and see what jobs are currently posted on our LinkedIn page, or by visiting www.clearcareerpro.com.